the poorest in communities around the world and countries around the world. And every tenth of degree of warming matters. Every fraction of warming matters. This has become even starker just the last couple of weeks as we've seen the devastating effects of heat waves in both India and Pakistan hitting those regions quite dramatically. Both of the delegations at the recent Track 2 dialogues were especially cognizant of the shared work that lies ahead, with both US and India having made significant pledges at COP26 in Glasgow, but both their own pledges and the global ambition, when we add it up, still falls far short of what's needed. The meeting was convened against the backdrop of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which raises the profile of energy security and the benefits of transitioning to clean local energy sources like renewables, but can also distract from climate action. With countries seeking to replace Russian imports, there is a risk they will turn to other sources, such as other sources of gas or even coal, to fill the gap and stall climate progress. And this was discussed amongst the participants, and how to actually ensure that the benefits of shifting to a clean energy transition are able to be highlighted in this moment. With this context, the US and Indian participants identified some key opportunities for and challenges to collaboration. Some of the opportunities included focusing on the linkages between mitigation and adaptation solutions, to elevate a focus on resilience. They also included a potential focus on global investment risk mechanism to unlock investments in the clean energy and climate transition. Collaboration with the International Solar Alliance on powering Africa, and on sharing technological and nature-based solutions, as well as partnering on the development and deployment of green hydrogen, especially for the shipping industry, amongst others. Both participants from both countries also identified the importance of tackling climate issues with the full toolkit of options, working across different ministries and at different levels of government, rather than relying on one policy tool or one ministry to solve the challenge. Both countries are grappling with how to implement a just transition, such that the phase-out of fossil fuels is complemented with realistic and place-sensitive retirement and re-employment opportunities for workers. And equity considerations played a strong role in the discussions, both in both countries, but also as they looked internationally in terms of solving the climate crisis and how we can work together. This was especially true as we witnessed tragic losses of lives, homes, and livelihoods from climate-related heat waves, floods, droughts, and other extreme events around the world, again hitting the poorest populations and people the hardest. The energy transition in India, like many emerging and developing countries, will not be possible without substantial flows of capital. And the delegates discussed the challenges we face as we see that the $100 billion per year commitment to deliver climate finance to developing countries has not been achieved by 2020, the target date, and still remains to be met, even recognizing that this was really a minimum and did not reflect the full needs. So the delegates in the dialogue in March recommended a number of different approaches to deliver on climate finance and the investments needed for the clean energy transition. And this is something that our panelists will delve into much more deeply now. So with that, let me introduce our wonderful panel of experts and leaders here today with us. And then I'll start off by asking each a couple of questions, and then we'll open up for questions and answers with everyone here in the room today. So first of all, we have Mr. Jamshed Godrej with us. He is chairman of the board of Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company Limited and the former chairman of Ananta Aspen Center. He sits on a number of boards and organizations working to tackle the climate and environmental crises, both in India and the US, and I'm honored to have him on our board. Mr. Godrej has been a longtime co-chair of the U.S.-India Track 2 Dialogue on Climate and Clean Energy, alongside the co-chairs John Podesta and Bill Riley. Bill Riley is here, was the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency between 1989 and 1993, during which he led efforts to pass a new Clean Air Act and headed the U.S. delegation to the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio in 1992. Bill has also had careers in non-governmental organizations and private sector finance, including more than 20 years as a senior advisor to TPG Capital, an international investment partnership, during which he was the founding partner of a private equity fund dedicated to investing in companies in the water sector. We're also honored to be joined by Dr. Frances Colón, the Senior Director for International Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress, where she leads a program to drive international ambition and action to meet global mitigation goals. Frances is the former Deputy Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, where she promoted integration of science and technology into foreign policy dialogues, global advancement of women in science, and climate policy for President Obama's Energy and Climate Partnership for the Americas. And then we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, is the founder, CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India, CEEW. Since 2010, he has led CEEW to the top ranks as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions, 8 years in a row, it's ranked up there, and among the world's 20 best climate think tanks in 2013 and 2016. He was actively involved in conceptualizing and designing the International Solar Alliance, among many other significant leadership roles in this space. So warm welcome to all of our panelists here today. And let me kickstart by passing a question to Jamshed, if I could. Jamshed, can you share your reflections on the importance of this U.S.-India relationship from the Indian perspective as we look at the clean energy transition and tackling climate change?
Thank you, Helen. Can I be heard? Yeah? Okay. Well, first of all, I must say that we have had a very long association with the Aspen Institute in India and the Aspen Strategy Group. And India, we have had a strategic dialogue, which was essentially focused on, India's place in the world and how we can actually make a close partnership with the US. And that dialogue has been now going on for over 25 years. And one of the things that came out of that dialogue was that India and the US need to work together on climate change and energy. And our other co-chair, along with Bill, is John Podesta, who was part of that dialogue. And he suggested that we start this discussion between India and the US. And now we've had 12 years of discussions. Every year we were meeting alternatively in India and the US, and except for the time of COVID when we were meeting virtually. And the whole purpose of this dialogue was to strengthen our partnership. The US and India have worked on many government-to-government programs to do with clean energy. There have been a lot of technical input, funding input, allowing India and the US to work together to develop clean energy, to develop ideas on how we can take this agenda forward. I think the biggest challenge for India is how do we actually have energy transition which is just. And as you all know, India has a very large percentage of its population which is still very much behind on development. And whilst we have to move away from coal, which is our mainstay for energy today, we also have to worry about, how we can actually make that transition in a way which will, ensure that we don't lose the energy that's required for industry, etc. Industry in India has been very strongly following energy efficiency and alternate energy. Solar energy has become a huge need for India. And I think we see the deployment happening. And this dialogue with industry has led to many new programs, such as green buildings and working on the connection between energy and water. So this dialogue actually has greatly enhanced the ability of India and the US to work together on all these challenges. We have achieved a lot of joint papers between our two sides, which are in the public domain. And these papers essentially have talked about, the challenges in front of us, what the solutions are, and how we can enhance that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamshed, and wonderful to hear about the background and the work of this dialogue. One of the key issues that was raised in the recent discussions was the need to get more private finance channeled into clean energy transition. And how are you seeing this progressing in India, and what do you think are the opportunities there?
Well, I think you mentioned clearly that the developed world had committed certain funds to India, but actually, as we speak, the requirement is much more than 100 billion. It's actually running into trillions now in terms of how do we finance this clean transition over the next decade. And India did sign up for a net zero, which is the date was given as 2070. This was done at the Glasgow COP. Actually, even though it's 50 years away, the government have also set near-term targets, 2025 targets and 2030 targets, which is 500 gigawatts of clean energy. These are huge targets compared to where we are today, and it's a big challenge, and the finance is really essential, for us to be able to achieve these clean energy targets. And I think the finance will be required not just for clean energy, but it'll be required for all the different interventions that are required, both adaptation requirements and resilience requirements in India. And India has a huge coastline, very similar to the US. We face enormous problems on our east coast of hurricanes on a regular basis. I think you're well aware of the sort of challenges you face here. This has displaced huge numbers of people over time. And all the reports from IPCC show, that the sea level rise for India is going to be one of the most devastating. And if you look at, for instance, our neighbor Bangladesh, they have a huge amount of mangroves and with very, very low-lying islands. And all of that area is supposed to get inundated according to the reports from IPCC. So, the challenges are enormous. We have a lot to do. And the finance is going to be essential to be able to do that.
Thank you, Jamshed. So the essential finance, much more than what was promised and not yet delivered, both for the clean energy transition and ensuring it's just. We're seeing an exciting example in South Africa on that, which we might discuss, but also for building resilience and adapting to the climate impacts we're already seeing hit. Thank you. Bill, let me turn to you if I could. Tell us from the US perspective how you see the value of this India-US dialogue and how that's been progressing.
Thank you, Helen. I would compliment the Aspen Institute as well for convening this and for even before the history that I was not aware of, out of which this group has come. I'm relatively new. 4 or 5 years I've been part of this co-chair, and would do anything that Jamshed asked me to do. He's an international environmental statesman who's been associated with so many things that I have admired. The establishment of Shakti was not mentioned. That was important. And he was on the board of Climate Works. And are you still?
And yes. Bill chaired Climate Works. He was our first chairman.
Well, it's always an honor to participate with him. And I was just laughing with Arunabha a few minutes ago because he takes heat because he's an optimist on the environment. Well, so am I. And we're both kind of out to lunch in the sense of being in a minority on that view. But it is a very strong group. I would say that the individuals who compose this group on both sides were chosen largely for their substantive expertise and also their access. And the way we have functioned is to be essentially opportunistic, to look at different possibilities, to things that might be in the interest of both governments at the highest levels, to whom we have access. Actually, the American group has lost a lot of its access because I think 5 of our people went to the White House and went to the government. So maybe, well, we lost some of the substances that they've represented, but maybe we still got the access if we need it. At any rate, these are very low-key, substantive conversations that we have engaged in for 12 years now, and have placed issues on the agenda quietly of both governments at relatively high levels. And some of them have been taken up, some of them have been partially taken up, some of them have been ignored or rejected. And so we labor on. The issues that we've taken on most recently have to do with de-risking investments in climate and environment, and looking at the ways to combine different public and private finance. And I have been so impressed myself to see how relatively small, in many respects, changes in the behaviors and criteria of financing organizations. I think of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which I dealt with and actually used some of their bonds to invest in the largest drip irrigation company in India. And in those days, they did not have the capacity to invest equity. It was strictly loans. Well, the loans were nice, and we had, I think, a couple of $100 million of their loans, and it helped make it all possible. But when they got the capacity to participate in equity finance, it changed altogether the capability, the possibilities, the aspirations and ambitions that they could reflect. And I remember that the fact that I had government bonds, they did not insure investments or anything like that, we didn't get that insurance. When I invested in the company I mentioned, I went to see Indian banks. My father was a small businessman, and he detested banks and bankers. And I went to them, and I asked them if they would consider, in view of the fact that the company we were proposing to invest in was essentially insolvent, was carrying way too much debt, that if they would consider forgiving $40-some million of loans. And I was amazed that they did. And I promised if they did, I would put at least that amount in private equity into it. But I gained from that experience a sense of the possibilities of relatively apparently small changes in criteria and finance, and the enormous possibilities that exist if people begin to think in a different way and look at de-risking things that previously were considered off limits. As when we invested, nobody had invested in private equity in India, and it was a successful investment.
Thank you, Bill. And at the moment, I mean, we do have, as was noted by Jamshed, we've got important, ambitious policies in India, of course, here in the US as well, in terms of the big targets. Trying to actually get the action on the ground is sometimes more challenging, and certainly in India there's an incredible commitment to getting renewable energy deployed, but it is difficult to finance. Do you see a particular role here for de-risking instruments that could come forward and could really help at this moment in time?
We've come up with some interesting institutional possibilities that deserve, I think, more careful attention and review than we can give it here today. And there's certainly a lot of criticism of the multilateral development banks and the degree to which they cannot create or have not taken it upon themselves to create an ecosystem of green investment. And the possibilities there are, I think, are enormous. I have to say, because I would like to simply acknowledge that we're functioning in an environment that has changed significantly just in the past several months. Yeah. And I'm reminded of a moment that I had when I proposed to, I had to schedule a meeting with President George H.W. Bush on climate and the environment. And I was about to go into his office as the National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, was coming out. And I asked Brent, I said, what's he doing right now? What's his mind on? He said, he's choosing the bombing targets for Baghdad tomorrow. Huh. I think I'll come back next week. It's a very difficult thing to run a domestic agency and to maintain the priority that a president may have when there's a war on. Wars are very bad for the environment. They're very bad for climate. And that's where we now are. I think realistically, we're going to be in severe competition for the kind of money that will be needed and the numbers that Helen described as we go forward. And so the priority must be on looking for individual leverage opportunities in the international agencies and the multilateral development banks, and our own foreign assistance, but recognizing that we're likely to be in competition not just for money for the war, but for eventually, one expects and hopes, reconstruction money for Ukraine.
Thank you. Indeed, definitely challenging times. Need to look for those opportunities. I will turn now to Francis, who I'm hoping might have some ideas on this, coming out of some of the discussions and the recommendations from the last dialogue. What is it you heard in terms of some of the potential opportunities to deliver on the climate finance agenda and support the energy transition?
So thank you, Helen, and thank you to Aspen for pulling this event together. I want to say I'm privileged because I'm home in coming to Miami, and I see a lot of my friends in the audience, and I mean that in the most sincerest way. In the front row, you have one of our best artists in the city who focuses on art to teach us lessons about climate. Welcome. We have Mayor Lerner in the audience, who's dedicated a lot of her career to these issues here, where we know we are ground zero for the impacts of climate. We have people that are heads of nonprofits here that focus on the environment. So I just want to give props to my Miami climateers and environmental leaders, because you've done such a great job, and I'm so happy to be here with you. So I have the privilege of helping coordinate this dialogue of these leaders of these two countries. And I want to say that there's a few common themes that run through this. One, John should alluded to, which is the fact that a lot of folks talk about the promises for the 100 billion and are we going to meet that promise? And the fact is we need a lot more to help these countries, these developing countries, transition away from fossil fuels to what when we say a just transition, what we mean is transitioning to a clean energy economy, but doing it in a fair way that takes care of the people that depend on fossil fuels for their jobs, and how you do that, meeting people where they are. Another theme that goes through these dialogues is figuring out where both countries have lessons to learn from each other, have knowledge and experience. One of the lessons I took away from my years working as a science diplomat was that the US has incredible experts, and we have amazing institutions, academic and research, but we can't solve all of our challenges alone. And climate change, the just energy transition, is a challenge that requires all hands on deck. And that is why it's so important for the US and India to collaborate on these things, because they would come to the table with expertise, with experiences that can be shared. So I'm going to tell you about 3 areas where we have seen that we can share knowledge, expertise, but I'm going to not talk about the climate finance angle as much. I'm going to leave that to my colleague, Dr. Ghosh, because it is such an important part of this problem, and he has been looking at it in so much detail. What I do want to tell you about is a couple of areas where we know that both countries are focused and we can learn from each other. More friends walking in. I love it. Thank you for coming. So transportation, electric mobility, right? Emissions from the transportation sector in the US are about 28%. In India, they're about 14%, okay? Both countries have made electric mobility a priority, getting more electric vehicles on the road, right? But what happens? In India, we have the challenge of these may not be as accessible. So you have a financing challenge. And so government, private sector are starting to collaborate to de-risk financing so these vehicles become accessible. In the US, as you know, we have big plans in our infrastructure package and in legislation that has not yet passed to make these things very much accessible here as well. But what are we learning about how we put these in the hands of families that want to make this happen, right? How do you do that? In terms of electric mobility, the Department of Energy in the US has started to issue loans to enhance the advanced manufacturing of vehicle components, right? Those are programs that other countries like India are learning from. Electric buses. India has an incredible public-private partnership on electric buses that the US is looking at very closely as we are trying to put electric buses more on the road, right? Electric buses in disadvantaged communities mean less pollution, and it also means reductions in emissions. So how do you do this in a way that brings us benefit where it needs to be? Countries learning from each other. One of the areas where we talk about we need to decarbonize. To reduce emissions, we need to decarbonize our economies. That's easier to do in some sectors than others. And one of the sectors where it's really hard is industry, right? Those are very energy-intensive processes where you are making steel and cement, right? And so what do you need to do? You need to find sources of energy where you still retain the energy intensity and you're able to carry out these processes, but the energy is coming from renewable sources. And so green hydrogen has been touted as this type of energy resource that could help us decarbonize industry. Both the US and India participate in partnerships where they could collaborate on green hydrogen to decarbonize and green industry and shipping. So they're part of a platform called the Quad, where they share a multi-country platform with India, Japan, Australia, for example. And there, they can collaborate on standards, common standards. How do you make regulation processes easier to make this more accessible? Safety standards. How do you work with the private sector and the public sector to really get this going? There's a green shipping network that was just announced between a number of ports and includes Mumbai, Sydney, Yokohama, and LA. How do you leverage that? And I know you're going to ask me the how. I'm kind of giving you the how now, so maybe the how. Leveraging these platforms. We have these multi-country platforms. We have these shipping networks where all these ports are collaborating. How do you leverage that to come together on the standards, the safety? Green hydrogen, the research behind it and how to make the cost of producing it. And when we say green, it means from renewable sources. There's hydrogen being produced that's not from renewable sources, from gas and from coal. No, we mean from renewable energy sources, right? Again, to lower emissions. And so we're talking about these countries coming together to figure out how to lower the cost of producing this green hydrogen. There's still many things that can be done to optimize these processes that we can do together. And then finally, India has a lot of experience working with deployment of projects in emerging markets. Mm-hmm. One of those markets where there's a big need, big demand is sub-Saharan Africa for solar. Rich in sources, high demand. India has experience there developing those projects. The US can bring the leveraging of the capital. How do we come together to deploy at scale? Not pilot projects, which we've done a number of, but how do we make this happen together at scale for a region like sub-Saharan Africa? So those are some examples of the types of things that we talk about as we are looking at decarbonizing economies, at transitioning in a fair way together.
Thank you, Frances, and for highlighting those specific examples where the two countries can work together and also with countries in Africa to advance this agenda. Thank you for that. Let me turn to you, Arunabha, now, if I could. What reforms do you think are needed at the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, so that they can also help better deliver climate and clean energy finance? As Bill mentioned, this is an area that certainly in the dialogue was highlighted for reforms needed. So what do you think we can do?
Thanks, Helen, and good day to everyone. Thanks to Aspen for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Good. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as my message echoes. Partly my task has become slightly easier given what Janet Yellen has said in recent weeks. You know, a year ago, perhaps I would have sounded more like a heretic, and now it seems to be more of the mainstream thing to say. But to answer your question, Helen, let's ask ourselves, what were the multilateral development banks and the multilateral financial institutions set up for initially? And I would argue that there are three ways in which the world has changed, and therefore there are three ways in which they have to reform. One of the reasons they came up in the post-Second World War era is because there was no other source of capital to help rebuild economies that had been devastated by conflict. And that's why it was called the International Bank for Reconstruction, literally reconstruction and development. The change that has happened now is that there is actually a lot of capital in other parts, in other types of institutions, including in the private sector, in sovereign wealth funds, in pension funds, etc., that are looking for ways to deploy. So MDBs are no longer the only source of capital. And therefore, change number one, reform number one, has to be to shift away from vanilla project financing to thinking about how do they catalyze financing from other sources of capital as well. And that's where the points that Bill was raising becomes important, that how are you no longer sort of just coming in to fill a gap or no longer crowding out private investment, rather you are crowding in by solving or serving that de-risking role. I can come back to that in more detail. The second way in which the world has changed. The multilateral development banks were built at the end of a shock. The two world wars were big shocks, right? And they were created to respond to the aftermath of the shock. The way the world has changed is that if you think about the climate crisis, it is already a shock, but the shocks are going to get bigger over time. So in a way, we are still at the bottom of how bad it could get. And the non-linearity of climate risks means that there has to be a different response, which means that the multilateral development banks have to think not about rebuilding, but making infrastructure and communities more resilient. Now, here's a factoid. We've just coming through 2 years of the pandemic, and it's not over. So many of you are having to wear the mask still. But Wimbledon, a tennis tournament, got more out of its pandemic insurance than all low-income countries got out of the World Bank's pandemic insurance bonds. That is the inequity we have in terms of the insurance cushions that we have created or currently have available to us. Now, if you accept my premise that we're still at the early stages of how bad it will get, and clearly the focus on resilience has to become the top priority rather than just the rebuilding of the aftermath of a shock. You have to do that work in advance. And therefore, how do you deploy things like the special drawing rights of the IMF? Where do you build an insurance cushion for the world's most vulnerable communities so that as shocks keep rising, there's something to fall back on? We were just discussing offline how even homes in the United States are now struggling to get insurance cover. Now imagine the home of a fishing community on the eastern coast of India. And the third way the reform has to happen is to think about the fact that the countries that got the initial voting powers in the multilateral development banks in the aftermath of the Second World War were also the countries that were the locomotives of the global economy. So you could print your own paper, you could build your own economy, and you could drive the global economy, and hence you had the voting powers. It made a lot of sense. The locomotives of the global economy now are increasingly the emerging markets. That's where growth is coming from. The energy demand for the global economy is coming from emerging markets. The consequences for what will happen in terms of the cumulative additions to emissions into the atmosphere will come from the emerging markets. But these countries can't print their own money, and therefore can't control their macroeconomy beyond a point. And yet you have institutions that are structured for a very different global economy. So how do you then have greater representation? So when we hear about more representation, more voting rights, etc., it's not just a question of equity. It is actually a response to a changed macroeconomy for which we don't have representative institutions. So once we recognize that the way in which the multilateral development banks were originally created, those basic premises have changed, that there are more pools of capital, that shocks will grow, and that the locomotives of the global economy rest elsewhere, we kind of get a direction of the way the reforms can begin to pan out.
Thank you, Arunabha. Important points there on the sort of multitude of shocks and risks we're facing and how we need to focus on that resilience, but also on representation, and that it really does matter in these international financial institutions. One further question for you. One of the challenges we do have now is getting investors, private investors, to invest in the clean energy transition or in resilience building in a number of developing countries. And in principle, some of the major institutional investors should be interested in doing so. They have long-term, more patient capital, but they're shying away from these markets. How can we change that?
Well, as we were discussing, or at least as I was proposing, there are pools of capital sitting out there. You have the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, representing about $130 trillion of capital, et cetera. So all of this capital is there, but unless the capital gets to where it's needed, it's sitting in some vault somewhere. What is the biggest barrier? Risk, right? But of course, at the same time, you wouldn't get rewards if you weren't taking risk. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that institutional investors, whether they are looking after someone's pensions or looking after the sovereign wealth of an economy, should just throw their money away. But there are different categories of risks. There are real risks and there are perceived risks. As an anecdote, let's think about how microfinance evolved. People originally were very worried about lending to the poorest. So, oh, the poorest will not pay back. The evidence was very different. Return rates on loans from the poorest was 99%, from the middle classes were 80%. Right? And suddenly you realize actually the poorest take smaller loans but have a better credit history. Okay. Now, if you think about emerging markets, of course, there are bad policies, bad politics, and yet you have to ask yourselves, how much is the delta between the real risk and the perceived risk? Once you start examining that, you often realize that actually it's not as bad as it seems. And you actually get far better returns than the 0% or 1% or 2% that your savings would earn in developed countries. So you have to find a common ground. And that is where de-risking has to come in. One of the challenges with multilateral banks is that they have country-specific programs. Now, if you have a country-specific program, you could be investing in a coal power plant, and you could be investing in a solar power plant. Right? But your country risk is the same. Your foreign currency risk is the same. Your political risk is the same. So you have to find a way of having multi-country programs, multi-country platforms. Francis used the word platform. Right? Multi-country platforms for pooling projects and pooling risks. And then you see what is the catalytic role that a multilateral development bank can play, and what a reinsurance company leader can play, and then what the treasuries of individual countries can play, and then, of course, what other institutional investors can play. Right? I want to close simply by something that came up in a roundtable we had organized in Abu Dhabi just before the pandemic hit, and it was a bunch of financial institutions who were talking about the same issue. And one person said, you know, the real risk is anecdotal risk. So I asked, what is anecdotal risk? So it's basically if I am looking at Indonesia and I go for a round of golf with my friend who's already invested in Indonesia, he says, I had a problem there and I couldn't get my money out. And he might have invested in a completely different sector, but that story stays in my mind. And the reality is that we have to then parse through these anecdotal risks, perceived risks, real risks, and then ask ourselves, how much of this can a country solve for? How much of its policies should it fix? And how much of it is out of its control? If the US Fed raises rates, regardless of whether money is going into coal or solar, the money will exit that emerging market and go back to the US, and that emerging market does not control the Fed. So we've got to figure out these multilateral and multi-country platforms that are a genuine conversation of partners rather than donors and recipients, big capital and small projects, and then see how different elements of this set of stakeholders can solve it together.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So very much focused on how the MDBs can help us with these multi-country pooled de-risking platforms. But also I do think there's a challenge there in terms of how do we move away from anecdotal risks, perceived risks, how do we actually really get people to recognize where there's real risks, tackle those, and not get caught in the trap of the anecdotal. Bill, I think you wanted to come in.
I wanted to add an element. Actually, mentioning micro-lending reminded me that I once found myself at dinner next to the founder of micro-lending, the Bangladeshi, whose name I've forgotten.
Mohammad Yunus.
What was it?
Mohammad Yunus.
Yes. And I said, is it true that you never lend to men? He said, men? Drink, whore, gamble, never lend to men. Oh, that was straightforward. I wanted to mention one of the impediments to investing, if you were running an ESG fund, for example, and you might like to invest in seafood farms, or seaweed farms, or mangroves, or small solar fields, and the bill is $2 to $3 to $7 million, and that's what it's likely to be in many of those fields. Well, if you are running a fund of a couple of $100 million, you can't really make investments at that amount. You just can't do it. You don't have the bandwidth. You don't have the staff to monitor, to control for the portfolio. So we need, and we did in fact in one of our sessions focus on the need for some kind of warehousing, some kind of aggregating enterprise that can take substantial amounts of money, but structure themselves with a significant enough staff, and probably we're talking about a public institution or a mixed public-private, to make investments of that sort profitable, realistic, manageable. And I think that's a reasonably straightforward, simple intervention that could make a very significant difference in the availability of capital to do some of the things that we most need doing, but the multilateral development banks are never going to be able to do.
Thank you. And so looking at how we can actually achieve those sort of aggregations, particularly in some of the smaller interventions we're talking about, how we can bring those together and get the financing flowing. Thank you, Bill. Now, I would like to take this moment to turn to those in the room for any questions you might have for our panelists. We do have a couple of roving microphones, so just raise your hand if you've got any questions or reflections, ideally indicating which panelist you might wish to pose them to. And if we don't see any hands coming up, I'm just going to there we have. I was about to threaten that I was going to keep asking. We have one over here in blue, and then a second one with Dan.
So this is for everyone. What's the role of transnational financial institutions such as the World Trade Organization and the IMF to accelerate the decarbonization worldwide?
Perfect, thank you. Before passing back to the panelists to answer that, I might take a couple more questions so we can group them, and then we'll pass back. So one question about what's the role of organizations like WTO and IMF? Perfect, and I think, Dan, over here.
Hi, thanks. So first I want to express my deep sympathy for people of India suffering these horrific heat waves, as Helen mentioned up front. I mean, this is just a taste of what's to come, and it's already horrible. So we all have lots of work to do. And then the second topic is sort of equally challenging, but I do want to turn to optimism. We heard about the challenge of the war in Ukraine as something that will distract attention of the world and also resources to rebuilding. And I want to ask the panel whether, the other thing we'll do, and we're seeing it, is sort of reorganize the global system in terms of alliances and supply chains as countries seek to disentangle themselves from Russia and potentially for related and other reasons from China. And so I wanted to see whether the panel has thoughts about potential opportunities, particularly for India, in this situation. I recognize that India is in a complicated strategic position vis-a-vis all of these global forces.
Thank you. Another important point. Can I check if there's one more at the back there? I see a hand. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts. I run a social business in organic foods, and we work with small farmers in India. And I really second the fact that small investments in businesses really can lead to cascading effects. Like we won a seed grant for which we were able to scale. How is it possible for the US and India dialogue to invest more and more into these smaller grant programs, not only just, and also have best practices sort of coming together to lead to more and more interventions and impact programs, because that's what's actually going to lead the way going forward. We work with more than 10,000 small-scale farmers across India, and it's a network which was actually set up by our first seed grant, which came together with a U.S.-India partnership, actually. So I think it's like a really good example. And I know there's no chance for a second question, but I would still ask this. But just the massive way the vaccination program was rolled out is a really good example of how we can achieve these sort of targets. So if there is a sort of targeted way of creating an impact of using funds in a certain climate change program, it's possible, you know.
Thank you very much. Let's start with those 4 questions to the panelists, and then we'll take another round if we can. So the questions were really around the role of the WTO and IMF and other institutions like that. Second, with the Ukraine crisis, is there actually some sort of opportunity, in fact, for India with shifting geopolitical ties in terms of supply chains and delivering clean solutions? Third was really how do we actually get grants to the ground, including for very small scale groups, and then potentially linking in with the vaccine there too. Let me start with Jamshed, yourself, and then I'll go down the line. Pick up 1 or 2 questions as you wish and feel appropriate. Over to you.
So I'll pick up the point that was made by the gentleman here, which is on the heat wave that is in India. And, you know, India has a very, very low level of penetration as far as cooling products is concerned. And one of the big challenges with all types of cooling products is they are huge energy guzzlers. And so there was recently a global challenge on a global cooling prize where, you know, you want high level of innovation so that you can actually be able to target cooling devices which use half the energy that are currently in the most efficient ones. And actually, this global cooling challenge did result in Indian companies, you know, getting involved in this challenge and finding a solution which, you know, is quite innovative because it uses both compressor cooling as well as evaporative cooling, along with artificial intelligence and sort of a very innovative software program that senses the humidity and temperature outside and inside and what is required for comfort. And they have all shown that it is absolutely doable in a laboratory scale work. So if this type of challenge, can be made to be commercially viable, it can actually result in a huge amount of saving, because India, the penetration is just 12% today for cooling products. So you have a huge amount of opportunity if you can actually meet that requirement for a low energy, where the affordability then for cooling products can increase rapidly.
Thank you, Jamshed. So helping to tackle both the sort of adaptation and resilience in the heat waves, but also keeping it low carbon, much more efficient. And the challenge is really making sure it's affordable for low-income households. Perfect, thank you. Bill, over to you.
I would just say that our conversations have revealed, particularly in Africa, where I think 75% of the people in the world who do not have electricity reside, India has been remarkably effective by reputation in doing projects in those circumstances, including with distributed energy. And it strikes me that one might well adapt some of that expertise to deal with the kind of food issue that you described and the need for small business lending and investment. I think that in the fields, I've been disappointed that some of the food ESG funds are basically about processed foods and high sugar foods and this kind of thing that we're used to and that's created so many health problems in our country. I think that if we moved to the kind of thing that I was talking about, and you actually identified sectors, and we very badly need one in the field of seaweed farms, which it turns out are something like 14 times more effective at carbon sequestration than was previously thought. Some research is just about a month old, and makes for very good cattle food, substitutes for some of the grains. At any rate, those are small investments. Those are $4 to $7 million, and yet everybody's got a coastline. The possibilities are enormous to create resilient responses to climate that sequester carbon, and to do so with a small grants program that is conceived to be that kind of thing, and probably would have to involve expertise in that particular dimension. And I think the same is true with respect to food, that a lot of people running ESG funds are not going to want to spread themselves in so many sectors that they lack expertise in. But I think that those are some of the directions that one could go.
Thank you. So bringing some of that expertise in to understand the opportunities there are and then combining. Thank you. Frances, over to you.
Yeah, I think I would say that one of the things that we're seeing as a result of this horrific war is that there's a lot of special interests and elements out there trying to take advantage of this moment, right? Where this moment when energy prices are high, and families around the world need relief in different ways. But we see this narrative of we must increase production, we must build more terminals, we must explore more, when all the data tells us that you don't need to do that to meet the needs, when all the data tells us that if we focus on energy efficiency, if we focus on accelerated deployment of renewables, if we do this together, that we can meet the energy needs, even if we, for a short time-bound period, we do have to diversify gas resources for Europe and make sure to get them through to the next 2 winters. Where our eye needs to stay on the prize and where we cannot let this narrative take hold is on the long-term future of how we use energy, what energy we use, what we lock ourselves into using for the long term. So that's one thing that's happening as a result of the war that I can tell you is something we need to keep our eyes on and not let ourselves get distracted from what we know. Renewable energy costs have decreased incredibly, and we can do this. We can accelerate this transition, and we can do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the impacts on many countries around the world from the war are being felt very much in what you said, in food. And so I think one thing you're going to see is that a lot of developed countries are starting to really rethink how they approach the climate problem and their response to the war. not getting distracted by the fossil fuel narrative of this is how we solve it, thinking about how we together collaborate to do that accelerated deployment, but also how we help developing countries meet this food crisis. And you're going to see that happen in the United States, and you're going to see that happen in a lot of countries around the world, where the focus is going to be as they reframe the climate policies and the things that they are going to be, legislation that's going to be passed, the budgets they're going to be asking for, are going to be focused on this. And this, in the US, will be a whole of government approach, again, where you can have USDA playing a big role, Department of Energy and others. And I think you're going to see a lot more focus on food security issues and doing that work on the ground than we had seen up to this point in the climate framing.
Thank you, Francis. And let me pass over to you, Arunabha. And I know you already mentioned the SDRs from IMF and how those can be used, but if you could say a little bit to IMF, potentially other institutions like WTO, that'd be great.
Sure. Let me start with IMF. I mentioned that, the great thing about the special drawing rights is that you don't need a payout of public money at the outset. It is a currency that you're creating. Of course, the value of the currency is based on the basket of currencies that allow for the SDRs to be created. But if we could, I mean, the $650 billion SDRs that were issued, if we could even take 10% of that and capitalize a resilience reserve fund, you have a potential $60-70 billion fund without any extra money going out of your treasuries. That creates a resilience cushion, to which then the reinsurance industry and others, et cetera, can attach themselves. But there is one more role which is often underestimated. The IMF does surveillance of all economies, and it checks how your macroeconomy is performing, whether it's the US economy or it's the economy of Vietnam. And if you're not doing well, it will tell you that you got to your exchange rate is going to fluctuate more, etc. Now, one of the things that the IMF can do is actually look at the potential impact of climate risks on the macroeconomy. Right? Just like the pandemic has shaved off several percentage points of growth rate, not just of what you had, but also the time it will take to recover. For many emerging markets, 100 million people have gone back into poverty. Now, we know that this asteroid is coming to hit us in the form of the climate crisis. So I would insist, if I were a board member of the IMF, that you've got to now do the surveillance of the macroeconomy with the climate lens. The second thing for the WTO, the Copenhagen not so successful COP and the successful Paris COP, during those 6 years, between 2009 and 2015, 11% of new WTO disputes were related to clean energy. Clean energy does not account for 11% of global trade. So what was happening? All the major economies in the world, US, Canada, European Union, China, India, were all raising mercantilist flags against each other even before that new energy sector had developed at scale. Now, if you now take Francis's point about green hydrogen and say, will we create mercantilist barriers against each other even before we've dropped down the price of green hydrogen from over $4 a kilogram to under $1 a kilogram? Or will we create the supply chains that Dan was referring to that are resilient, that are interdependent? And what does interdependent supply chain mean? Where does the critical mineral for the membrane come from? Where does the membrane get manufactured? Then where does the actual electrolyzer get manufactured? Then what are the protocols for safe transportation and storage? Then who or where would you have the actual offtake of green hydrogen? Then you create an interdependent manufacturing and trade and investment relationship, rather than each country saying, we are going to be export hubs of green hydrogen, not asking who's actually going to import. So we've got to start thinking about leveraging these multilateral institutions that we have, whether it's in finance or in trade, to see even within their existing scope of rules, how do we use them to actually catalyze these markets that require a lot more scale of investment than they're getting thus far.
Thank you, Arunabha. A very strong call there for using the multilateral institutions in a better way to look at these supply chains, but also, for example, in the IMF, to have a strong focus on the macroeconomic surveillance, bringing climate lens into that. They've done that before for some of the small island states, but as we're seeing in India, in the US, and many other countries around the world, with the impacts we're seeing with climate now, it should be across the board.
That's right.
Thank you. Important points. Are there a couple more questions? I think I saw one down at the front here, and there's one at the side here on the right. We could just take those two, I think. That would be great.
Thank you. This is just fascinating, and I truly appreciate your sharing your thought processes with us. When you talk about India's penetration of 12%, I worry about my island, twin island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, and I wonder what their penetration is, because the income inequity is ridiculous everywhere, including in America. My question is anybody besides America, the parts of America that are trying to claim that methane is clean? Is that happening anywhere else in the world? And can we stop that? Because we cannot solve the problem if we're denying one of the major causes of the problem.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question. I think there was one at the back there. And then one final one. Perfect.
Hello. My question is, when we're trying to transition to this clean energy, are we thinking about the life cycle of all these products? And what's going to happen, for example, if we implement solar panels and then in 10 years you need to replace them? Where are they going? How are we going to recycle them? Where's those materials going? Are we considering that? My second question would also be on the perception of risk, because there's acceptable and tolerable risks, and I'm finding that it's such a very interesting problem amongst society, because we either don't know that we're so vulnerable or we're just so okay with being so vulnerable. And I think there's a lot that we could do towards messaging and figuring out mitigation and adaptation strategies moving forward.
Thank you. Two good points there. And that last one, particularly as we see people adjust and assume they can't manage the risk, so they just go forward. We'll take one more question down at the front here, and then I'll pass back to the panelists. Thank you.
I was just wondering about the Brahmaputra Valley in Bangladesh. There's a large population there, and could somebody just talk a little bit more about how threatened they are? What is the immediacy? And all these people are going to come to India, and what's going to be the effect of that?
Okay. Thank you. We'll stop there with the questions, and we'll pass to those who are interested in taking any of these. I think there's one on fossil gas, from natural gas, fossil gas, and how that's perceived as a transition fuel, and then a few others there. Bill, let me start with you. I think you're...
I was struck by your question about methane. When I was in office, we did a study of methane emissions and discovered that the methane emissions from the Soviet Union exceeded the entire emissions budget of the Federal Republic of Germany. They were that serious. My impression is that that has not changed that much. It's always been a mystery to me because it is product. It is valuable product. And our own companies took a long time to appreciate it because it was still cheaper to allow it in drilling and transporting. But at least the Obama administration published a very effective, I thought, rule on methane. It was discontinued after they left office, but I think this administration has indicated they're going back to it. But it ought to be relatively straightforward. There are illness issues related to it. There are fire dangers. There are all sorts of things, atmospheric impacts, of course. And it ought to be a dealable problem once you acknowledge that it's also a valuable product. And I know I have heard more than one energy executive say, I was amazed to discover how much valuable product was just going into the atmosphere, but we were just using conventional drilling practices, fracking practices. So it's something that ought to be addressable. The information is around to address it, and I think it needs communication. And if you get that, people will begin to notice that we have regulated it, and the oil industry is living with it, and oil and gas, we're prepared to live with it, and I think others will as well.
And this is one of the areas that was actually one of the successes, I think, coming out of the Glasgow Climate Conference last November, where a number of countries around the world got together and actually agreed to a global methane pledge to try and reduce methane emissions
Yes, Russia
by
did not.
2030. There's a few countries that are not on there that need to be on there.
Yes.
Absolutely. But it is an area where I think there's quite a bit of focus now, much better monitoring, and some solutions hopefully coming forward in multiple countries.
Could I ask a quick question of Francis on green hydrogen? I have long looked at hydrogen as kind of hopeless in the future. Governor Schwarzenegger had a hydrogen car. President Clinton came out. George W. Bush came out. Anyway, not much, it seems to me, has happened. However, one of the major cruise lines, the second largest, has committed to build 2 hydrogen-powered ships.
Yep.
These are billion-dollar ships. And there is a difficulty. It takes away, apparently, from whatever reasons I don't understand, from the number of cabins. Those are not, at least if they're built today, they're not going to be green hydrogen. What do you think about as a transition going to hydrogen fuels that are not green?
And as you pick this up, if there's any of the questions that have been from the audience, please feel free to pick them up as well, Francis. And Arunabha, can I pass to you and Jamshid for final thoughts too? Great, Francis, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline, for your question. Another amazing activist and champion here in South Florida for all of these issues. So thank you for coming and being here and for everything you do. I'm with you. I think that this narrative, I think we started the narrative with gas, calling it liquefied natural gas to make it sound pretty. It's not pretty. This is not a good transition source of energy, and we need to move away from those narratives. But some of the people in this room do the best work I've seen on changing narratives around these things. And so I think that's the work we need to continue to do. And like I said, we need to drill down on this because of what's happening around the war. I think on green hydrogen, I'm from the camp of no gray, no brown, no blue. I know that there is going to be a transition period for green hydrogen as well, and Arunabha will prop me up here. But in the ways in which we lock ourselves into these transitions, before we reach the full renewable, before we go fully green, as we have done with gas, we lock ourselves in. And what we are seeing is that there's all of this talk of taking terminals and turning them into blue so that later they will be green. And once you make those investments, it's much harder. And so the idea is to push for transitioning to making those investments, to de-risking this, to finding those multi-country platforms, to be able to do this together so that we don't lock ourselves in to what we are calling transitions and saying, well, it's okay for now. That now, those are not real nows. Those are things that will lock us in for decades, and then it's going to be even harder. So the work to do this jump is now, very much now.
Absolutely. Arunabha, over to you, and then Jamshid.
But there was one more question there that I'm just blanking out on. There was a second question related. If you could repeat.
So my notes are a little bit messy. Could we get a repeat on that?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Indeed, and I think this also links to the question about Bangladesh.
Yes.
So let me first just take on the hydrogen point as well. There is a rainbow of hydrogens. Right? There's gray, blue, green, turquoise, all sorts. Pick your color. Now, the reason this goes on is because, of course, the energy context of different countries is different. So they think of different transition plans towards hydrogen. A year ago, I counted 32 countries that had, plus the European Union, that had programs on hydrogen. A year later, now I count 38 countries plus the European Union, right? But what do we not have? We have no global definition of what is green hydrogen. What do we not have? We have no global rules for how hydrogen is transported, stored, used, right? So you can't go towards that cleanest form of this critical industrial fuel of the 21st century without a rules-based framework. There will be B2B tech cooperation, investment cooperation, but we do need G2G collaboration as well to create that architecture within which investors and innovators can operate. Which brings us to this whole issue of risk. I think in general we need to follow a risk approach. We keep thinking about how risky is it to invest in solar, how risky is it to invest in small solar and distributed energy, but we don't ask the question, how risky is it to not invest in all of this stuff, right? And in order to do that, it's not just a question of, oh, well, it is risky, let's invest. We have to get granular. In India, we are currently at CW, we are developing the first high-resolution climate risk atlas. But we need to do that in Bangladesh, we need to do that in Chile, in Mexico, in Vietnam, right? That at a district level, at a sub-district level, right? Francis, you were telling me in the county we are in, there are what, two dozen municipal organizations, right? So now each one has to have a risk assessment of how its territory gets impacted by nonlinear climate risks. And only then we'll be able to say, which part of Bangladesh will get impacted in which way, and then are we just protecting lives through early warning of the oncoming cyclone? Are we rebuilding livelihoods, right? So risk is actually a function of the natural impact, the sensitivity of the community there, and the administrative capacity to respond. So risk is not just a natural factor. So this risk assessment is absolutely critical in order to then change the equation for the investors. And hang on, it does not make financial sense anymore to put the head in the sand.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Arunabha. And let me pass to Jamshed. Any reflections on the questions in the discussion?
Yeah, no, I think, all these questions are really important and relevant. I would only, again, come back to what are established good practices in renewable energy, especially on solar. And one of the biggest problems we have, the risk with solar energy, is that all the panels are made in China. And we need, a huge global revolution to make solar panels. This is a well-established technology. It's also well understood how clean it is. It doesn't have the controversy of hydrogen, and the use of hydrogen for industrial use, etc., will come very soon. But this area is going to be badly impacted because the world is not ready to manufacture, and India is going to be a huge user of solar panels, and we need enormous investment in building factories at scale as large as China or even larger, because otherwise we won't be able to keep that renewable cost down. So whilst we look at all these new ideas and technologies, etc., I think the established one needs to have a lot more investment. And this is where we talked right in the beginning about the type of investment that's required around the world. And India is a good example of being a country which has promoted the Solar Alliance and has enormous amounts of sunlight, but just not enough production. And related to that, again, if you don't have a lot of innovation in these panels, for instance, recently I found that there are panels which can accept solar energy from both sides, direct from the sunlight as well as reflected sunlight, and you can get 20 or 30% more output from it. I mean, these are the sort of innovations, and like that, you need many, many more innovations, because otherwise the land use, with large amount of solar is also going to, be competing with agriculture and others. So I would say that, there are, whilst we have all these challenges, but we need to move on the well-established alternatives and do them at scale in such a way that we can move much more rapidly on renewables.
And that's an area where the IFC actually did something very positive and progressive. A $500 million investment in Tamil Nadu for solar panels. Was that the first for them?
Bill, I think, there's a lot of interest like this one, but the problem really is that there are state policies in India which become barriers sometimes. We have a state electricity system which has been very politically deciding tariffs. And for instance, even in the recent election in the state of Punjab, all the political parties went out there to the electorate and said, we'll give you free power for agriculture. And what happens is that when this happens, these projects don't get financed also, because you see the risk involved with all these state electricity boards, which are generating as well as distributing and are bankrupt. So there are many such challenges, and I hope that the politicians will let's say be more reasonable to understand that you cannot be offering free power, free water to agriculture. I mean, it is a commodity. Agricultural products also are sold at a good price in India because there's a guarantee from the state to buy rice and wheat at a particular price, which is actually quite remunerative. So many challenges.
Thank you.
And I would note, Jamshed, it's not only in India where you get some state policies that interfere and slow things down.
Surely
there may be
not.
some in this room who can
Surely
relate
not
to that,
here.
and I believe that has occurred. I won't in any way try to sum up this fantastic discussion, but I do want to highlight just sort of 4 points that came out clearly, and then I'm going to briefly pass back to each of our speakers for their one key takeaway that they want you to walk out of this room remembering. So let me highlight just a couple of things that came up here. One, we did recognize this challenging moment where we've got ambitious commitments on the table, but really struggling to get the finance flowing, even that which has been committed. And this is going to be even more challenging in the current situation with the brutal invasion of Ukraine and the effects on energy prices, food crisis, and of course, financing flows around the world. Second, we talked a lot about how we can actually use multilateral institutions, what public financing is flowing to better de-risk investments and attract private finance rather than crowding it out. We talked about a number of different ways of doing that, pooled de-risking platforms that can operate across countries, talked about aggregating a number of different investment opportunities and using warehouses to be able to actually get that investment flowing. We talked about the role of the World Bank, the IMF, even the World Trade Organization to help shift things. Third, we did say very strongly that we are living in a world now where we need to understand the multiple shocks that are hitting in any given country and how much more frequently these are happening. So it's not just a single crisis, it's actually a multitude of crises, and certainly from the climate perspective happening more and more frequently. So strong focus is needed then on resilience building, on adaptation, not just on mitigation. Fourth, we actually identified a number of specific opportunities to look at for channeling financing, whether that was electric buses or other transport, green industry, including steel, cement, shipping, green hydrogen, and not trying to cover the other rainbow of colors of hydrogen, but green hydrogen, but also things like US and India potentially working together with countries in Africa in terms of clean energy financing, and this important look at what this might mean in terms of opportunities for supply chains. Across the board, we discussed the importance for just transition, for jobs, for communities, for the poorest, the low-income households, communities, and countries, and how we can ensure that the finance and the resilience building and opportunities actually reach these groupings. And finally, I believe we did have a call quite explicitly that we should be lending to women. So I'm going to leave it there with those. But Let me pass briefly to each of our speakers the final word that you would like everyone from this room to take away.
Well, I
Jamshed.
think, I mean, it's an obvious issue that India will face enormous challenges, as the warming takes place. As it was noted, we already had 45-degree temperatures, record temperatures in most parts of India in the recent past. And this will only exacerbate the problem of removing poverty. And I think what is happening is with the slowdown in the global economy, growth and getting development to make a difference is going to be very badly affected with climate change.
Absolutely. Okay. Bill?
Well, the decisions made by Americans and Indians are not sufficient to solve the climate problem, but it will not be solved without them. And I have been enormously impressed by the intellectual firepower that exists in India. Something like a third of all of the startups in Silicon Valley are run by Indians. And we are having, I think, a very productive conversation, focusing on some very significant issues, some of which we have yet to make substantial progress against, but we're certainly aware of what they are. And I find it tremendously rewarding to work with the people we're working with. And I mean, these are the problems that if we can solve them, they matter to everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. Francis?
I think to remember that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Let's not get distracted by the narratives that say that we can't do this right now, that right now we've only got to send as much gas as possible to one place. Those are narratives that distract from the problem. We can do that. We can help our European colleagues, we can solve the energy crisis, and we can deploy renewable energy, and we can collaborate with India on developing alternative supply chains, and we can address the food insecurity problems. So let's stay focused. As people from Miami in this room know, we have an immediate crisis here in the US, here in a place like Miami that's ground zero for climate, and we need to be able to do the things that will keep our families and communities safe. We need to hold leaders accountable to pass the climate legislation that we need in this country for everybody, and we can address global problems together with our allies.
Thank you, Francis. A strong call out for Miami here. Thank you. And Arunabha.
In 2010, when my organization CEW was set up, India had less than 20 megawatts of solar. It now has more than 50,000 megawatts of solar, 105,000 megawatts of solar and wind and biomass, 155,000 megawatts of all non-fossil electricity capacity with a target of 500,000 megawatts by 2030. So the slope of the curve will keep rising. But guess what? 63% of emerging markets, not including China, are already peaking or plateauing the use of fossils in their electricity sector. This is an opportunity for a double leapfrog, for energy access and for decarbonized electricity. But as that song goes, this revolution is not being televised, right? So here is an opportunity for the world's largest source of institutional capital and the world's largest demander of institutional capital come together to create a market for the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thank you to all the fantastic panelists, their remarks, and to everyone here for the wonderful questions and comments. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you to have you.